Hey guys and girls, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you a simple way of loading and saving player data. Before we get started, it may be a good idea that you have read the DataStore article before watching this video, so I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video. A very important part of this article is the limits section. So if we scroll all the way down to limits, and here we can see that there are server limits and experience limits. If we first look at the server limits, we can see that there is a limit to how often we can use the getAsync function. And we can use 60 plus the number of players times 10. So if there was one player on the server, that would mean we could use the getAsync function 70 times per minute. Let's now look at the experience limits. So set, increment, update, and remove async have an experience-wide limit. If we assume that your game has 3 servers and we call these servers server A, B, and C. Now if server A uses the setAsync function to write some data to a key, that means server B and server C are not allowed to set data to that same key until 6 seconds has passed. To get started, I'm first going to create a baseplate project. In order to use the data store, we must first publish our game. So I'm going to go File, Publish to Roblox, and you would here create your new game and publish it. But I'm just going to update an existing project called Test, like so. We now need to enable Studio to access API services. To do this, I'm going to go to Game Settings and Security, and I'm going to enable Studio access to API services. And we can read here, enable Studio access to game services such as DataStore. So I'm going to turn this on and press Save. The first thing I'm going to do is create a folder inside of server storage. So let's add a folder, and I'm going to name this folder Player Data. Now inside of this Player Data folder, we can put any folder we want. So for instance, I can create a folder called Data1, and I can put another folder called Data2, and I can also put another folder called Leader Stats. Now inside of these folders, we can put some values. So for instance, inside of Leader Stats, and if I scroll all the way to the bottom, I can place a bool value, I can place an int value, I can place a number value, and I can place a string value. Now I'm going to first place an int value, and I'm going to call this gold. And I want the player to start with 10 gold, so I'm going to change the value from 0 to 10, like so. And inside of the Data1 folder, I'm going to add another int value, and I'm going to call this apples, and I'm going to keep this at a value of 0, so the player starts with 0 apples. The next thing I'm going to do is create a script inside of server script service, and I'm going to rename this script to be called DataStore, and I'm going to delete this print here. Now the first thing I want to do is get the DataStore service. So I'm going to say DataStore service equals game get service DataStore service. The next thing I'm going to do is use this service to get the DataStore, and I'm going to call this DataStore player, but you can call this DataStore anything you like. And the next thing I'm going to do is connect to the player added event so that I can detect when a player enters the game. And I'm also going to connect to the player removing event so that I can detect when a player leaves the game. Now, when a player enters the game, what I'm going to do is loop every folder within inside the player data folder and clone it and place it inside of the player. So let's first loop the player data folder. And let's now clone the folder and parent the clone into the player. If we now play the game, we should notice that inside of our leader stats we have 10 gold, and if we look inside of our player we can see that there is a data 1 folder, a data 2 folder and the leader stats folder, and if we look within these folders we can see the gold value and the apples value. So we can see that everything was cloned correctly into the player object. Now that we have successfully cloned the folders into the player, let's attempt to load the player's data from the data store. So I'm going to say data equals DataStore get async, and I'm going to use the player's user ID as the key to get the data. There is a chance that the getAsync function may produce an error. So that we can handle this error correctly, we're going to need to place this function into a P call. But before I show you how to write the P call, I'm going to show you how to write this in a different way. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste this code, and I'm going to replace the colon with a dot, and for the first parameter that goes into the function will be the data store. So these two lines of code are the exact same. So as you can see, when we use a colon to call a function, Lua will automatically put this value into the first parameter of the function, where if we do not use a colon, then we have to manually put the value as the first parameter in the function. So let's now call the pcall function, like so. And the first parameter this function requires is the function to call. So I'm going to copy and paste this, and this is the function that the pcall is going to call. And you can see we must use a dot and not a colon. And now we need to pass the values we want to pass into this function. So the first value is not the user ID, but is the data store. So we first pass the data store, and then we can pass the user ID. The pcall function will return two values, and the first value will be a boolean and will be true if there were no errors when calling this function, and will be false if there were errors when calling this function. And the second value, if there were no errors, will be whatever this function returns, but if there were errors, then this variable will contain an error message. So now that we've called the getAsync function using pcall, we no longer need these two lines. And now I'm going to check if the function was successful. So I'm going to say if success equals false, I'm going to kick the player from the game and give them the message that DataStore failed to load, and I'm going to return out of this function, preventing the rest of this code from executing. I'm now going to print this data value, so I'm going to say print loaded, and I'm going to pass this data value. And if I now run the game, we can see it says loaded nil. So what that means is there was no data inside of the data store, and the data value is equal to nil. So what I want to do now is, if data is equal to nil, I want to change data to equal to an empty table. But there's slightly a better way of writing this code here. Instead of doing the if, what I could do is say data equals data or an empty table. And I can delete this code here. So what this is doing is saying if data is equal to something, then data is just going to equal itself. But if data is equal to nil, then it's going to equal to this empty table. And now inside of this loop, where we loop every folder inside of the player data folder, what I'm going to do is use the folder's name to see if there's data inside of this data table using the same name. So what I'm going to do is say local subdata equals data, and I'm use the folder's name to try and get the data. And if this data does not exist inside of this data table, then this value will return nil. So to prevent this, the subdata from being nil, what I'm going to do is the same thing what I did here and say or empty table. So subdata will first try to equal to this, but if this is nil, then subdata will be an empty table. And now, after we have cloned the folder, I want to loop every child of this clone. So let's say we cloned the data1 folder. I want to loop every value inside of this folder, and the same for all the other folders. So what I'm going to do down here, I'm going to create a for loop, and I'm going to say for I child in clone get children. And now I'm going to set the value of this child, which is going to be the apple and the gold, to whatever data is saved in the subdata. So I'm going to say child.value equals subdata, and I'm going to use the child's name to find the data within the subdata table. But if the subdata does not contain the value for this child, this will return the value of nil. And instead of passing the value nil into this value, which will produce an error, I want to pass the default value. So we can see the default value for gold is 10 and the default value for apple is 0. So to do this, it's going to be pretty much the same as this. So I'm going to say or, and I'm going to pass the child's value. So if this value is found inside the data store, we're going to set the value of the child, but if the value is not found, then we're going to use the child's original value. So now that we're loading the data, now let's do the same but in reverse and save the data. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a table called data, and it's just going to be an empty table like this. And I'm now going to loop through every folder inside of this player data folder again. And the only reason I'm going to do this is just so that I can find these names, so I will know what folders to find inside of the player. So I'm just going to copy and paste this code here to loop every child inside of the player data. And now I'm going to create another table called subdata, and it's going to be equal to an empty table. And now I'm going to loop through every child inside of this clone folder, and in order to find this clone folder, I'm going to use this folder's name. So I'm going to say for I child in player, and I'm going to use the folder's name, and I'm going to get the children of this folder, which will be this clone folder that we placed into the player originally. And now I'm going to save the child's value into the subdata using the child's name as a key. So I'm going to say subdata, and I'm going to use the child's name as the key, and I'm going to say equals the child's value. And now that we've placed all the child's values into the subdata table, I'm now going to put the subdata table into the data table using the folder's name as the key. So I'm going to say data folder.name equals subdata. Now I'm going to save this data table into the data store, And this is almost identical to the way we did it up here. So I'm going to copy and paste this line down here, and I'm going to change getAsync to be called setAsync. And I'm going to add another value, and that is the data table to the end here. So we're going to set this data table using the player user ID as the key into the data store. And finally, I'm going to print the value that we saved into the data store. So I'm going to change this to saved, and I'm going to pass the data table so we can see what was saved into the data store. Now we have a small conflict where instead of printing this data, we're printing this, which is going to equal nil because the setAsync function does not return any value when we use it. So I'm going to change this to be value, like so. And I also want to change the one up here just to keep consistent. So this is going to be called value, and I'm going to print, change this to value like so. And I'm going to move this down like so. And I'm going to change this to a new local variable. So data is going to equal to value, or if value is equal to nil, it's going to equal an empty table, and then I'm going to print the data variable. Now this code may work most of the time, but there are two problems. The first problem is if success is equal to false, then we kick the player and return and don't clone the folders into the player. So when we kick the player removing event will fire, and here we attempt to get the folder from the player, but this folder will not exist, so this will produce an error. So what we need to do is keep track if the player was loaded, and if the player was not loaded, we want to skip this code here. So what I'm going to do at the very top over here, I'm going to create a new table called loaded, and at the bottom of this function I'm going to set loaded to true using the player as the key. And now inside of the player removing event, I'm going to check the loaded value to make sure that the player was previously loaded. So I'm going to say if loaded using the player as the key equals to nil, then return, and that's going to prevent this part of the code from executing if the player was not loaded. And finally, after we have saved the data, I want to set the loaded value to nil. So I'm going to say loaded using the player as the key equals to nil. The second problem we have is when the server shuts down, the server does not care what code is running and will blindly stop executing code to shut down. So what we need to do is keep the server running so we have enough time for the player's data to be saved into the data store. There is a function called bind to close that allows us to keep the server running for an extra 30 seconds. So to use this bind to close function, at the very bottom I'm going to say game bind to close, and I'm going to pass in a function. And now I'm going to make this function wait while there are still players inside of this loaded table. So what I'm going to do is say while next loaded is not equal to nil, and inside of this while loop all I'm going to do is task wait. So when the server attempts to shut down, it's going to call this function, and this function is going to constantly loop while there are values inside of the loaded table, and it's going to keep waiting over and over and over again until the last player is removed from the loaded table. And once all players have been removed from the loaded table, this while loop will no longer loop and it will exit this function, allowing the server to close. There is an exploit that allows players to duplicate items. For instance, if we imagine that we had a remote event and this remote event allowed players to trade their apples to other players. So what someone could do is call this event and leave the game at the exact same time. So the order of these two events will be unknown. And if we imagine that the player removing event gets called first and the trade event gets called second, what would happen was the player's data will get saved with the apples in their inventory, and then the apples will get traded to the next player and they will leave the game with the apples still in their inventory, and the other player will have the apples in their inventory. So now both players will have the apples. So to prevent this exploit from happening, what I'm going to do is delete the folder once we have saved the folder's data into the data table. So I'm going to say folder destroy. And now the trade event will no longer work because we're going to use find first child in order to get the folder when editing the values within the folder. So this function can no longer work after the player's data has been saved. So I'm now going to delete this remote event. And if we now test the game, we can see that an empty table was loaded. And the reason why it's empty a table instead of saying nil is because data will equal an empty table if value is equal to nil. And if I stop the game, and we can see it was saved, and if we look inside of this table, we can see there is a key called data1, which is this folder here, and there's a key called data2, which is this folder, and a key called leader stats. And we can look inside of these tables and we can see that apples equals 0, and we can see gold equals 10. And if I play the game a second time, we can see that this time, instead of loading an empty table, we loaded the previous saved table. And all the values remain how they were last saved. And if we stop the game, the data is saved once again. So now that we're saving and loading the player's data, let me show you how to edit the player's data. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new int value, and I'm going to call this value login counter, and I'm going to have it set to 0 as default. And now I'm going to create a new script, and I'm going to name this script login counter, and I'm going to delete this print here. And inside of this script, I'm going to connect a new function to the player added event. And now I'm going to wait for the DataStore script to clone this data2 folder into the player. So I'm going to say local data2 equals player, wait for child, and I'm going to wait for the data2 folder. Now, wait for child will wait for this data2 folder forever, but there is a chance that the success is equal to false, and if success is equal to false, then the folder will never be cloned into the player, so this wait for child may wait forever. So to prevent it from waiting forever, I'm going to put a timeout of 10 seconds so that if this data2 folder is not cloned into the player within 10 seconds, then data2 will be equal to nil. And if data2 is equal to nil, which means the data2 folder was never found, what I'm going to do is return out of this function early. So if data2 is equal to nil, then return, which will prevent any of the code we write underneath from executing. But if the data2 folder was found, I'm going to increment this login counter by 1. So to do this, I'm going to say data2.loginCounter.value plus equals 1. So if I test the game again and look at the loaded data, we can see that data2 has an empty table, and if I stop the game to save the player's data and we look inside of this saved data, we can now see that data2 is no longer an empty table, and if we look inside this table we can see that it has a value of login counter equals to 1. And if I play the game a second time and look into the loaded data, we can see that the login counter is still equal to 1, and we can even check the data inside of my player. So I can click on data2 and click on the login counter, and we can see that the current value is equal to 2, so we know that the script incremented it by 1. So when I exit the game, it should save this 2 into the data. So let's stop the game and let's look inside of the data, and we can see that it was incremented from 1 to 2. What I've done now is inside of Workspace I've created a folder called Spawns, and inside of this folder I've placed some parts and anchored these parts, and I've also set can collide and can query to false, and you can see that anchored is equal to true. And another thing I've done is gotten an apple from the toolbox, and I'm going to put this apple into a new folder called meshes inside of my server storage, like so. I'm now going to create a new script inside of server script service, and I'm going to call this script spawn apples, and I'm going to delete this print from here. And the first thing I'm going to do is create an endless loop. So I'm going to say while true do, and I want this loop to loop every 5 seconds. So I'm going to say task.wait 5. I'm then going to loop every part inside of the spawns folder. So I'm going to say for I child in workspace spawns get children. I'm then going to clone the apple mesh that's inside of the meshes folder, and I'm going to position the clone at the same position as the part inside of the spawns folder, and then I'm going to parent the clone into the workspace. I'm now going to attach a touch event to the cloned apple. I'm then going to attempt to get the player from the touched part. So I'm going to say local player equals game.players get player from character, and I'm going to use the parts parent. Now if the part that touched the clone is not a character, then the get player from character function will return a value of nil. So we first need to check to make sure that player is not equal to nil. So if player is equal to nil, I'm going to return and prevent the rest of the code from executing. And now I'm going to try to get the data1 folder from the player. So I'm going to say local data1 equals player find first child data1. So now there's a chance that this folder will return as nil, and that will happen if success is equal to false, so that the folders were not cloned, or if the player's data was already saved and the folder was destroyed. So what we need to do is say if data1 equals nil, then return. And now what I'm going to do is destroy the clone, and then I'm going to increment the apple value by 1. So if we test the game, we can see that every 5 seconds the spawn parts spawn a apple mesh, and if we look inside of my player and inside of data1, we can see that apples is equal to 0, and if I touch these 4 apples, I now have 4 apples, and if I touch these apples, I get more apples. And you can see as I keep touching these apples, my apple value keeps increasing. And if I stop the game, we can see when I first entered the game, my apples value was equal to 0, and when I left the game, my apples value was equal to 17. What I've done now is inside of Starter GUI, I've created a Screen GUI, and inside of this Screen GUI, I've created a frame, and inside of this frame, I've placed a UI corner to make rounded corners. I've created an image label with an apple image, and I've created a text label with an apple text. Inside of the text label, I'm going to create a local script, and I'm going to delete the print. And I'm going to name this local script to Apple GUI. And the first thing I'm going to do in this script is get the local player. So I'm going to say player equals game.players.localPlayer. I'm then going to wait for the data1 folder to be cloned into my player. So I'm going to say local data1 equals player wait for child data1. And then I'm going to wait for the apples value. So I'm going to say local apples equals data1 wait for child apples. And then I'm going to set the text label to get the amount of apples that I have. So this is the script's parent. So I'm going to say script.parent.text equals apples.value. And now I want to detect when the apples value changes so that I can update the text. So what I'm going to do is say apples.changed, and I'm going to connect a function, and this function is going to return the value that the apples value is set to. And inside of this function, I'm going to simply set the script.parent.text to the value. So we can see when I last entered the game, I had 17 apples. So if I press play once again, we can see that it says 17 inside of our GUI. And we can see that 17 was loaded from the table. And we can see that as I collect apples, the text updates. And we can see that I have 32 apples. And if I stop the game, we can see that the value of 32 was saved into the data store. What I've done now is inside of the plugins tab, I used the build rig button to create a dummy, and I've named this dummy to shop. And inside of the head of the dummy, I've placed a proximity prompt, and I've called the action sell, and I've called the object text apples, and I set the hold duration to 1. Inside of the proximity prompt, I'm going to create a new script, and I'm going to rename this script to sell, and I'm going to delete this print here. And now I'm going to connect a function to the proximity prompt's triggered event. So I'm going to say script.parent.triggered, and I'm going to connect a function, and this function is going to tell me which player triggered the event. Now, when the proximity prompt is triggered, I'm going to try to get the leader stats folder and the data1 folder by using find first child. So I'm going to say leader stats equals player find first child leader stats, and if leader stats is equal to nil, I'm going to return. But if leader stats is not nil, I'm going to try to find the data1 folder, and if data1 folder is not equal to nil, I'm going to continue. And the first thing I'm going to do is add the amount of apples to the gold value. So I'm going to say leaderstats.gold.value plus equals data1 apples.value. So if the apples value is equal to 10, we're going to add 10 gold to the gold value. And then I'm going to set the apples value to 0. So if we test the game again, we can still see that I have the 32 apples and I have the default 10 gold. And if I come over to the shop, we can see the proximity prompt. And if I press the E key, I should add these apples to gold. So I should have a total of 42 gold after I sell my apples. So I'm going to hold the E key, and now we can see I have 0 apples and 42 gold. And if I stop the game and we look at the saved data, we can see that the leader stats gold is set to 42 and the apples is set to 0. I'm now going to add another value that I want to be saved into the player's data store. So I'm going to press the plus sign and scroll down and add a int value, and I'm going to rename this value to storage, and I'm going to set the default value to 10. Now inside of the starter GUI, I've added a new frame, and just like the Apple frame, it works exactly the same. The only difference is instead of using the apples value, we're using the storage value. And I'm also going to make a small change to the spawns apple script, and just before we destroy the clone, I'm going to make sure that the apple amount is less than the storage amount. So I'm going to say if data1.apples.value is more than or equal to data1 storage.value, then return, which is going to prevent this part of the code from executing. So if I test again, we can see that I still have 42 gold, and I have the new default 10 value for storage, and I still have 0 apples. And if I go to collect some apples, once I reach 10, I should no longer be able to collect any more, and I will be forced to go sell my apples. So now I have 52 gold and 0 apples, and now I can collect another 10 apples before selling them again. What I've done now is created a new dummy called Upgrade. You can see him here, and inside of his head I've added a proximity prompt with the action text of upgrade and a object text of storage. And if we look inside of this, we have a script called upgrade, and when the proximity prompt is triggered, I first try to get the leader stats, and if the leader stats is not found, we return. Then I try to get data 1, and if data 1 is not found, we return. And then I check to make sure that the gold value is greater than or equal to 10. So if it's less than 10, we're going to return. But if it's more or equal to 10, I'm going to deduct 10 gold, and I'm going to increase the storage value to 5. So if I test my game, we can see I have a storage value of 10 and a gold value of 62, and I can currently only store up to 10 apples. So if I go up to the upgrade NPC and upgrade, I get deducted 10 gold and my storage increased to 15. So now I should be able to hold a total of 15 apples, and I can go and upgrade my backpack once again and again, and keep upgrading. And now I only have 2 gold, so my backpack should no longer upgrade. So we can see it gets stuck at 40, and I can now hold a total of 40 apples, and I should be able to sell all 40 apples to get 42 gold. Thank you for watching my video, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below.